This is Dirk Van Damme, and I'm going to present you the webinar presentation that I provided on the 7th of May conference. And because of many people not being able to receive the PowerPoint presentation, and because of some bandwidth problems, we decided to re-record the presentation and to make it available for many people on the website. So let me introduce myself. My name is Dirk Van Damme. I am a senior counselor at the Directorate for Education and Skills at the OECD. Before that, I was an academic. I was professor of educational research at Ghent University. And I also was active in the Flemish government, serving several ministers of education as chief of staff and advisor. So I have a long and broad experience in the educational domain. I would like to speak to you about the concept of global competence and why education is so important for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me bring up my presentation. Okay, there we are. The Sustainable Development Goals are actually the most important goals for human development that humanity has ever defined. They are incredibly ambitious. They set the right kind of goals and targets to be achieved by humanity, by the international community in 2030. However, the progress to the achievement of the SDGs is long, and it's not an easy road. It's a long and winding road. And I will probably give you a maybe not so optimistic perspective, but I think a realistic perspective on where we are with the SDGs. 17 SDGs, and I'm convinced that you all are very familiar with each of them. Stretching from poverty to inequality, to infrastructure, to justice, and most importantly, for our topic for today, also quality education. When we monitor the performance of the SDG targets, the goals and the targets, and we have published a very interesting monitoring report at the OECD. We still see that 10 years from 2030, we lack significant progress on many, many targets. Some areas are better off. They have targets which are really close to being achieved. But for many other fields, you have still a long way to go. And also in the field of education, SDG 4, you see that the 10 targets, so one of them is already close to achievement, but that's probably the easiest one. But the others are still far from where we should be. Monitoring progress is actually a very important mechanism and a tool for convincing all partners, not only countries, but also donors, also people on the ground, to reinforce and to strengthen and to accelerate their efforts in realizing and achieving the SDGs. The 10 targets for SDG 4, the SDG on quality education for all, are listed here. And they are very ambitious, but they are the right kinds of targets. They have been formulated after a very long process of negotiation, of working with experts, of political discussions, and they have been endorsed and supported by the global community. So that's actually incredibly important. The endorsement and the support by the international community is probably the single most important strength of the SDGs. SDG target 4.7 is probably the most important one for our topic of today. It's also the most ambitious one because it's quantitative, but it's also qualitative. And I'm going to read the very important formulation of target 4.7, and actually every word counts here. Every word has been negotiated. By 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity, and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. It's a long sentence, it's a very ambitious sentence, and it includes many aspects, but it's also a very interesting, very promising target for the SDG 4. Where do we stand actually now with SDG 4? I already gave you an idea that there is still a long way to go when I briefly looked at the monitoring tools. But in fact, the reality is that we are not on track to SDG 4 to achieve it by 2030. And we still have the perspective and the potential that we are leaving hundreds of millions of children, young people, and adults behind on every continent by 2030. There are still massive disparities in country performance, in regional performance, in performance across groups for the different SDG 4 targets, especially in terms of educational outcomes. And as you know, SDG 4 is not only a quantitative goal. It, like maybe the Millennium Development Goals were the predecessors of the SDGs. SDG 4 has the unique capacity and unique characteristic that it tries to achieve quality education for all. So measuring learning outcomes, looking at the educational outcomes for young people, for adults, for all learners is actually incredibly important. Especially the low and middle income countries are still lagging behind. This is not to say that the rich countries are doing any better. The rich countries are also stalling or actually moving backwards in achieving high quality and equitable education. They are also slipping further away on learning outcomes indicators, but low and middle income countries also don't see a lot of progress. Priorities are mobilizing the necessary resources and concentrating efforts on making progress. And that's where a lot still needs to happen. We have not yet, as an international community, we have not yet been able to mobilize the necessary resources for achieving SDG 4. And finally, there is still a lot we don't know. At the OECD, we do our utmost best by supporting the UN family and UNESCO more in particular with the right kind of data for filling the data gaps that we see. And SDG 4 still has a very important challenge, although it's probably one of the better SDGs in terms of monitoring and data quality, but we still are facing very difficult data gaps in our evidence base, especially for low income and middle income countries. To give you an idea on one of the indicators that UNESCO is using for assessing progress towards SDG target 4.7, we still see that many countries have difficulties in fully integrating human rights and freedom principles in their education policy, in the curriculum, in service, teacher training, etc., etc. So you see that actually a minority of countries have fully integrated the basic principles of SDG target 4.7 into their education system. And this is not a very optimistic chart. It shows that in many areas of the world, across middle income, poor countries, rich countries, we see still a big important deficit in implementing the human rights and freedom principles in education. To understand where we are with the SDG implementation and why we are still looking to a very challenging trajectory towards 2030, we need to look at the political context. And of course, this is a bit sensitive and politically sensitive, but I want to give you the right kind of background, at least as we at the OECD experience it. We are in the middle of the international community. We work with all kinds of partner international organizations. We work with countries, and we feel daily let's say, the temperature with regard to the SDGs. And the temperature is actually quite low for the moment. Countries are not really motivated to make a lot of progress. And progress is actually slowing down after the initial enthusiasm of the first years. Progress is actually slowing down now. And the political support is also dwindling. We see it in discussions that we have in our committees at the OECD. Some countries say, well, we don't see the SDGs really as the guiding framework for international development and cooperation. One of the important psychological aspects of the lack of political support is that some countries don't want to be blamed. They are very reluctant to be held accountable. Some countries also say quite bluntly, well, we have maybe agreed on a diplomatic level with these targets and with these goals, but we don't see this as really guiding our own policies. And that's very unfortunate. I think that's really a missed opportunity. I think you have to see this against the background of a more general political and economical backlash against globalization. A global agenda is seen by many countries and also many experts and individuals and observers and commentators as part of a globalization agenda. And for several reasons, the globalization agenda is looking very grim. Has to do with political developments, has to do with the migration crisis that some countries have perceived. It also is not supported, of course, by the current COVID-19 crisis, where the global agenda is actually suffering, and many countries are going back to a rather nationalistic and or protectionist agenda. Global trade is in danger, and many other aspects of globalization are also jeopardized. Of course, this is also reflected in the political domain, and important parts of the political spectrum now reject the globalist agenda, more specifically on the neoconservative and populist right-wing side of the political spectrum. And they see a globalist agenda as actually something that needs to be actively resisted. So that's not only the support which is dwindling, but also the active resistance against what they call the globalist agenda is increasing. And you see this in a couple of countries very clearly. But it's not only the United States, it's not only the UK, although Brexit, of course, has also contributed to this political development, but you see it in several other countries, even those countries which are usually perceived to be more on the progressive side. On the other hand, and that's a personal note that I want to add, and it's probably rather controversial, many people will not agree with it, but I see in the discussions in the international community that if people also politicize the SDGs too much, then they just amplify the resistance on the other side. So we see an increased polarization in the political debate on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I personally think that this is a counterproductive development. We have to seek the middle ground. We have to see where we can unite people across the different political spectrums and to have a large political support for the SDGs agenda. So this is not a really positive or optimistic context that I'm giving. To illustrate this, I'll just show you, in my view, a rather impressive picture from the Brexit discussion way back in 2016. But it shows very clearly this sentiment, especially amongst the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people of our societies, that the globalist agenda is seen by some as something of the elites, something that governments imposed on them. And this is not just because people are ill-informed or miseducated or whatever you can call it. This is a real perception and a real political sentiment across large sections of the populations in many countries, not only the rich countries. And to give you an illustration of the kind of statements that are made at the far right neoconservative and populist spectrum, this is just a picture from a website where universities are being attacked as being globalist propaganda organizations. When you would look at this ignorant, you would say, well, universities, of course, they have a global ambition. They work for research, they work for global networks in education, they serve international students. But if you read the article, it's actually a very strong attack against the globalist agenda and a defense of a purely nationalist agenda. I'm not saying that this is a very dominant way of looking at globalization and the global aspirations in the SDGs, but it's very powerful and it's not to be neglected. Okay, let's now move after this first section on the SDGs and where we are to the topic more directly. What's the role of education in moving forward the SDGs and in achieving the SDGs? And I would like to point to what experts have been calling lately the multiplier effect of education. And it's very well illustrated in a website which is developed by a group of experts and published by the Financial Times. You see the web address at the bottom of the slide. And they have been illustrating the multiplier effect of SDG 4 on all the other SDGs. Actually, what they picture here is that SDG 4 is actually the central SDG, and that progress in almost all other SDGs is dependent on success in SDG 4. That's a very strong statement, it's a very strong argument, but it's supported by evidence and it's true. At the website, you can look at every single of these arrows. I just want to illustrate it with two examples. For example, relationship between SDG 4 and SDG 1. SDG 1 is about poverty. It's about eradicating poverty in the world by 2030. And the relationship with SDG 4 is very clear. Higher levels of education make sure that people get out of poverty, that poverty levels are decreased. Of course, there is also an inverse relationship. As long as people remain poor, they will not benefit as much from education. They have less access to education. They don't have the kind of prerequisites to benefit from education. But the important message here is that actually SDG 4 is an incredibly important condition for achieving the ambitious poverty goal in SDG 1. Another example is about SDG 16, which speaks about peace, justice, strong institutions. And again, we see the same kind of relationship. SDG 4 contributes to the achievement of SDG 16 because education has a very important impact on antisocial behavior, on crime, on conflict, etc. Education contributes to a better understanding of our democratic institutions and democratic processes. So education is actually, again, a condition for achieving the goals of justice, democracy in SDG 16. The relationship in the other direction is also true. School attendance significantly decreases when there is an armed conflict, when a region or a country is in civil war, for example. But again, the centrality of SDG 4 is the most important message here. And there is all kinds of research which demonstrate that if you increase, even by a modest 5%, the high school graduation rate in the United States, for example, you would save an enormous amount of money in reduced crime and higher levels of compliance with democracy. Why is this the case? Why is education so central? And that's a question that we have been investigating at the OECD, and more specifically at the Center for Educational Research and Innovation that I'm leading since 2008. That's a question where we have spent a lot of research time on. And every time we try to make relationships between education and what we call social outcomes, we see this kind of relationship, which is depicted here for health. So more educated people report to be more healthy. We still don't know exactly why that's the case. And further on in the presentation, when I move to global competence, I will probably try to give a little bit of an explanation. But the correlation here, it's not a causal relationship which is depicted here, but the correlation here suggests that there are various mechanisms at work in education which have an impact on health behavior, health consciousness, health knowledge, and that education has an important role in stimulating the kind of knowledge and behavior that is responsible for a more healthy lifestyle and a more healthy experience. The same is true for if we look at many other kinds of social outcomes. And I'm looking here at interpersonal trust, which is a very important indicator also for the topic of global competence. Interpersonal trust is probably one of the most important dimensions of what we think is a high quality society. And again, we see that interpersonal trust is correlated very clearly with higher levels of education. So the more people are educated, the more they are inclined to trust other people. And you see that relationship almost in all countries, although the general level of interpersonal trust might be very different across countries. At the left of the chart, you see the Nordic countries, the Netherlands, but also Switzerland and some others, where you have, in general, quite high levels of interpersonal trust. People trust each other. At the right side of the chart, some countries in South and Eastern Europe, but also in countries like Turkey, you see much lower levels of interpersonal trust. And work of sociologists has demonstrated that interpersonal trust is actually one of the most important determinants of quality of living, quality of society, but also of many other aspects which have an impact on global competence, for example. You see this relationship here. Every line is a country. If you increase the years of schooling, you increase also the levels of interpersonal trust. And the same relationship for a very close by indicator of social outcome of education, which is tolerance towards migrants. And tolerance towards migrants is probably even more strongly correlated with levels of education. So the more educated people become, the more tolerant they are against migrants, and the more tolerant they are also against the asylum seekers and other dimensions of migration. So then the interesting question is, what makes people, or what makes education so powerful in producing these positive social outcomes? And again, that's a question where we still don't have the final answer. Is it mere just years of schooling? Is it being exposed to schooling experience? Is it just educational attainment? Or is it a more deep impact of learning on behavior, on cognition, on social emotional skills, etc.? We also think at the OECD that although we only have really trustworthy data from schooling, but any kind of educational experience, also non-formal and maybe probably also informal, might produce the same kind of positive outcomes. Is it a selection effect? That's a very important methodological question. Are people self-selecting by moving forward in the educational trajectory? Or is there any causality involved? And for that, you need longitudinal data, of course. Is the transformative power of education due to the intended learning in the curriculum? For many countries, this is the case, because many countries still or already have those very clear expressions of learning goals and objectives in the curriculum, which have to do with these positive social outcomes. Or is it the unintended consequences of the school experience, of living together with your colleague pupils in the same context, in the same environment, experiences on the playground, etc. So education or schooling is not only the intended curriculum, there are many other aspects of the experience, the student experience, which might be important, right? Also values at stake, which are transmitted through what people call the hidden curriculum. So the question on how education is producing positive social outcomes is actually a very important one and a very interesting one to understand why education has this important multiplier effect. At the OECD, we have been working quite hardly over the past years on understanding the curriculum. When I use the word curriculum, I'm not only referring to, let's say, the explicit curriculum, which is stated in the national curriculum or in curriculum objectives, but also the hidden curriculum, the value system that is behind the curriculum, etc. And we now see, and this is represented here, what we call the learning compass. We see the curriculum as actually a mixture of knowledge, attitudes, skills, values, which together compose competencies. And you have the core foundation skills, which we measure, like literacy, numeracy, etc. But you also have what we call more ambitiously the transformative competencies, which are characterized by the fact that people who achieve those competencies, they create new value. They are able to reconcile tensions and dilemmas in life, in society, in their environment, in their neighborhoods, and they take responsibility. These three dimensions of transformative competencies have not been formulated just behind the desk. They are the result of very long and intensive discussions that we have organized in the OECD with all kinds of stakeholders, policymakers, practitioners, etc. So coming now closely to the concept of global competence, we think that global competence can be seen as an expression of those transformative competencies. Global competence creates new value. It's able to reconcile tensions and dilemmas. And above all, it induces people to take responsibility. Global competence is not, and I think this is also important, it's not an expression of a particular political ideology. It's not an expression of a globalist worldview. It's not an expression of feelings of compassion, empathy, or solidarity. And it's not just an expression of intercultural sensitivity, although elements of all these might be integrated in the concept of global competence. But I would be in a disagreement with some statements that I'm sometimes reading, that people want to reduce the concept of global competence to a specific way of looking at the world. Of course, if you have a globalist worldview, you are probably more inclined towards high levels of global competence, but it's not synonymous. We see global competence at the OECD as an integrated set of knowledge, cognitive skills, non-cognitive skills, attitudes, and values. It is probably a little bit confusing these days that many people use very different concepts to maybe indicate what they mean in this arena. You have concepts like global citizenship education, intercultural education, human rights education, education for sustainable development, etc. After long discussions at the OECD, we came to the conclusion that actually global competence is probably the clearest and simplest expression of what we want to say in this area. But of course, the reality is that many concepts are used, mixed together, and that is not always contributing to the clarity of the argument, and it's not always very conducive to convincing policymakers of the importance of the topic. So that brings me to the next section, which is trying to go a little bit deeper into the definition of the concept of global competence. And I'm using here the important work that has been going on in PISA, the Program on International Student Assessment. You know the PISA test from its triennial test of literacy, of mathematics, and of science. But since a couple of years, we include also what we call an innovative domain in the PISA assessment. Not all countries are obliged to take this innovative domain in and to include it in their national assessment, but many countries do. And in 2018, we have included global competence in our PISA assessment. The data are still being analyzed, so unfortunately, I cannot present you any real data on the PISA 2018 assessment of global competence. We schedule the publication of this book in the fall, probably October or November. But what I will do here is to build on the, let's say, the preparatory definitional work, the development of the conceptual framework and the development of the assessment framework. A lot of work has been invested in this over the past years, work with many experts. So what I'm presenting here is actually the result of an important collective effort to come to a better understanding of what we exactly mean by global competence. And it's only by really very well defining the concept in its details, of course, that you are able to move to an assessment. So basically, global competence, as I mentioned a minute ago, is composed of these 4 different categories. Knowledge, there is certainly a knowledge dimension in global competence, cognitive skills, social skills, attitudes, and values. Values have, maybe unfortunately for some of you, remained outside the scope of the assessment. We still have the ambition to move to maybe, but that will be a longer term enterprise, to move to an assessment of values, but that's a very difficult thing to do. And PISA has very high standards in the conceptual and assessment frameworks. So we are not yet able to define and to move to an assessment of what we mean by values. But of course, they are very important. We will never say that values are not important. We just say that we are not there yet in developing an assessment framework for the value dimension of global competence. So they have stayed beyond the scope of the 2018 assessment. The knowledge and the cognitive skills dimensions have been tested in a cognitive test of students, and the knowledge, cognitive skills, and also the social skills and the attitudes have been assessed in a student questionnaire. So what do we see as the building blocks of global competence? And after long discussion, we came to the understanding that actually 4 different dimensions are very important. The first dimension is the more cognitive one. A person with high levels of global competence is able to examine local, global, and intercultural issues. So the person has the capacity, the cognitive capacity, the background knowledge to effectively understand and examine the situation in other parts of the world, in other cultures, etc. So that happens through effectively combining knowledge and critical reasoning to establish an informed opinion. A second dimension, understand and appreciate the perspectives and worldviews of others. So this comes closer to, let's say, appreciation of otherness, to not only know, but also understand and have a positive appreciation of the fact that people, other countries, other cultures have different worldviews. And that happens by recognizing that perspectives and behaviors are shaped by various influences and concepts of reality. So the very strong element of diversity in worldviews, in intercultural sensitivity, is important here. Third, and that's more moving to attitudes and actually also behavior, engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions across cultures. Building on the two previous dimensions, people have to be able to effectively engage in dialogue and interactions with other cultures, with people from other origins, other countries, different backgrounds. And that happens by understanding the cultural norms of different contexts and adapting behavior and communication accordingly. So to adjust your behavior, your communication style to the intercultural situation that people are confronted with. And then finally, the action component, take action for collective well-being and sustainable development. So intercultural understanding and the concept of global competence is not something which is purely done behind the desk. It also requires action. And it requires people to be ready, to be willing to take informed, reflective action to improve living conditions in one's own community, but also beyond. So this action component is for us an intrinsically important dimension of the whole concept of global competence. I'm not going to dig deeper into, let's say, the knowledge and cognitive aspects of the concept of global competence. I think that's pretty clear for all of you. What is probably less clear, and where we try to also move the frontier in research and understanding at the OECD, is the social and emotional foundation of the concept of global competence. So you have already seen that social and emotional dimensions, they do play a role in the concept of global competence. And I would like to dig now a little bit deeper into this. In various areas of work in the OECD, we are making progress in understanding better the social and emotional context of learning. And that's very important. We, of course, in the long-term history of PISA and PIAC and other assessments that we have been developing at the OECD, we have concentrated mostly on, let's say, the foundation cognitive skills like literacy and numeracy. And people have sometimes criticized the OECD as being obsessed with cognitive foundation skills. That's not the case. It's just a matter of fact that developing a better understanding of the social and emotional dimensions of learning is very difficult, and to develop an assessment framework which meets the complexity of social and emotional learning is also very demanding. But a lot of research progress has been made by different researchers and teams in the world, and we are trying to build on this research in developing our own view, our own definitions, our own conceptual frameworks, and our own assessment frameworks for social and emotional learning. You see here the, let's say, the mapping of the skills which we define under the concept of social and emotional skills. It's based on what personality psychologists call the big five. You see these 5 central blocks, which task performance, sometimes also referred to as conscientiousness. You have emotional regulation, collaboration, open-mindedness, and engaging with others. And then you have also 3 more compound skills where a lot of these other skills come together: critical thinking, metacognition, and self-efficacy. So together, these 19 social emotional skills, they provide a rather comprehensive mapping of what we call social and emotional skills. And we are now developing or implementing this framework in various assessments for different age groups. We just published a very interesting report on socio-emotional learning for very young kids. We are moving forward in the assessment of 10-year-olds, and we are also integrating the framework in assessments like PISA and even in PIAC for the assessment of adults. To immediately jump into what we have found already, and I think this is a very important chart, we see that those 19 social emotional skills, they correlate very, very clearly with the concept of global competence. I'm not going into detail how we did the assessment to come to this result, but you see that for two age groups for which we have already data, the 10-year-olds and the 15-year-olds, you see a clear correlation between the concept of global mindedness, as it is called here, and those 19 social emotional skills. So the standard regression coefficients, they go rather high for some of these skills, not unexpectedly for something like tolerance, but also for metacognition, for example, which is actually very interesting. People with high levels of metacognition, they also achieve higher levels of global mindedness. Curiosity, also interesting. Creativity, achievement motivation, self-control, and so on. So this is actually demonstrating that the other way around, global competence correlates very highly with very important social emotional skills. So the concept of global competence undoubtedly has a cognitive dimension, but it also has a very strong social emotional dimension. I referred already to a report that we published on the social emotional development of 5-year-olds. We did the assessment in 3 countries, in England, United States, and Estonia. And this chart shows that already by 5 years, you see a very strong development of some of those skills. We have not tested 5-year-olds for all of those 19 skills, but we tested them for different dimensions of what we call pro-social behavior, trust, and non-disruptive behavior. You see that the distribution is already quite large at the age of 5 years. So some people, young kids, already achieve very high levels, and others achieve rather low levels. And the distribution of those skills is, of course, not unexpectedly correlated with socioeconomic background, with cultural background, even with migration status. You also see some differences already at the age of 5 between countries. With Estonia, which is probably typical for, let's say, the more Nordic view on education and learning, being a bit more positive on non-disruptive behavior and on trust. And that's interesting to see that already at a very young age, some of the different dimensions and different characteristics of learning systems become visible. Of course, these are all correlational data still, but we also did some research a couple of years ago based on existing longitudinal databases, which probably induces to say that some of the learning in the social emotional domain has a causal impact on behavior later on in the life course. So the correlations that we see in a lot of our research, they probably have some causality underneath of them, although we are not able to demonstrate that with our data in PISA and other assessments. But I'm just giving you as an example this this Korean chart, And the dependent variable is whether a kid is going to bully others at school at the age of 15. And the propensity of bullying at the age of 15 is not so much influenced by the development of cognitive skills before that in primary school education in this case, but it's more caused by the development of one of those 19 social emotional skills, in this case responsibility. So if people, young people, kids, are learned to behave responsible already in primary school and already in pre-primary education, their propensity, the chance that they will be bullying others in secondary school at the age of 15 decreases significantly, and for people with high levels of responsibility becomes almost zero. So this is based on longitudinal data. It shows causality, and it illustrates that in this case, bullying as a form of non-social behavior is actually not so much influenced by cognitive development, but by social and emotional skills development. Some people think that social and emotional skills are part of what you can call personality, and that personality is given by birth, and that these skills are not learnable. All the evidence that we see, not only in our own work at the OECD, but in work of so many researchers around the world, is that these social and emotional skills are learnable and are learnable across the whole life cycle. That's also the reason why we include now measures of social emotional learning in the next cycle of PIAC, the Program of International Assessment of Adults. So agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, openness, they all are learnable across the life course. And of course, some stages in the life cycle will be more important than others, but it's not the case that people at a certain age have a very stable personality and that this doesn't change anymore over life cycle. And it might lead to the conclusion that if we come back to global competence and the social emotional loading in global competence, that actually people can learn global competence at any age in their life cycle. I have been speaking a lot about learning global competence, but what about educating global competence? What can schools do? And that's, of course, a very important political question. And it makes also the cycle of my argument round. So if education is so important for achieving the SDGs, and if global competence is one of the transformative competences which we try to develop in education, and if global competence, thus higher levels of global competence, is going to be incredibly important in moving the world forward towards the achievement of SDGs, the question then is, what can schools do to foster the development of global competence? And of course, in the conceptual framework and in the assessment frameworks that we have developed, there are already a lot of keys to solve that question. Developing better understanding of cultures, developing communication across cultures, etc. But we try to maybe write down a little bit more specifically what schools can do to foster the development of global competence. Provide students with opportunities to learn about global developments that affect the world and their own lives. Very important. Teach students to develop a fact-based and critical worldview. Equip students with an appreciation of other cultures and an awareness of their own cultural identity. This is maybe interesting because In some cases, I see literature about global competence, which is coming rather close to denying your own cultural identity and to acquire a kind of cosmopolitical identity instead. That's not what we think is important. We think that understanding and being aware, appreciating your own cultural identity is a necessary condition to appreciate cultural identities of others. Engage students in experiences that facilitate international and intercultural relations, and promote the value of diversity, very important, which in turn encourages sensitivity, respect, and appreciation. Assessment is, of course, a critically important component of any educational enterprise. The question about assessing the learning of global competence is also really important. And these questions are actually what teachers should keep in mind when they try to work with the concept of global competence. Are students, for example, able to critically examine contemporary issues of local, global, and intercultural significance? Do students understand and appreciate multiple cultural perspectives, including their own? Are students prepared to interact respectfully across cultural differences? Do students care about the world, and do they take action to make a positive difference? What inequalities exist in access to education for global competence between and within countries? And what approaches to multicultural, intercultural, and global education are commonly used in school systems worldwide? It's a very interesting question also for the OECD. And how are teachers being prepared to develop students' global competence? I would like also to point to, and that refers also to some of the questions in the webinar, to the importance of, let's say, not only the explicit curriculum, but also the school environment and the hidden curriculum, which is in fact becoming manifest in the school climate. Because there is a lot of research which demonstrates that a positive school climate is incredibly important in developing the kind of cognitive and non-cognitive skills that are embedded in the notion of global competence. And I'm showing you here an important chart from the PISA 2018 assessment, which is referring to the importance of school climate, and it shows you the number of, or the percentage of students who report that there is bullying going on at least a few times a month in their school. And you see that there are some countries where bullying is reported by 30, maybe in some cases even 40, and exceptionally 50% by students. Of course, in such a school climate, educating children for the kind of understanding, tolerance, pro-social behavior that we want to develop is not going to be very easy. So a positive school climate is very important in moving students forward. And in the same sense, we see in our assessments of social and emotional skills that we are developing that these skills flourish in a much more cooperative classroom climate. And that is true for probably all of those skills, maybe with the exception of critical thinking, which is a little bit of a specific case here. But if students learn in a very positive, cooperative classroom climate, then they are probably also better in learning the social and emotional skills, which then in turn are important for moving the target of global competence forward. Besides the curriculum, also pedagogy is very important in fostering global competence. And based on our work, we have come to the understanding that Apart from structured teaching, this chart is not to say that more directed, teacher-directed instruction is not going to be important in developing global competence, but it has to be complemented by other kinds of pedagogies in order to be effective. Organized discussions, for example, where students present evidence, express their views, listen, and are willing to change opinions when confronted with new information. This is a very powerful pedagogy in developing global competence. Moving a little bit to a more ambitious level, structured debates where students are supposed to argue, often in opposition to a polemic point of view, prompting them to delve deeply into a particular issue, and still understanding the other side. This is a very important pedagogy in developing the kind of higher levels global competence that we want to achieve. Group-based cooperative project work, so where people can work together, communicate, learn, evaluate each other's progress, equally important. And then finally, which is still an underdeveloped domain, it's very much in the coming into the interest of policymakers and practitioners lately, but not so many examples of successful implementation we see so far, but service learning. Service learning meaning that students participate in real-life activities where they contribute to the development in their own community or in other communities, linked to what they have learned in the classroom. Service learning is probably a very promising area of pedagogical development in this space of global competence. So that's actually making the circle of my argument round. I would just like to finish this presentation with a couple of conclusions which summarize the key points of my presentation. Education is key to all the SDGs. It has a very strong multiplier effect. So that implies that as an education community, we have an incredibly important responsibility in moving the SDG forward, because by achieving the SDG 4, we will also make sure that progress in the other SDGs is possible. The positive role of education is not only function of the quantity of education, the level of education achieved by the population, but even also of the quality, the nature and the cognitive, non-cognitive skills that are being developed in learning. As part of the powerful transformative competencies, global competence is actually a very important target in the learning ambition that is underpinning SDG 4. But it has not only a cognitive, but also a very important social and emotional loading. By moving the social emotional learning forward, we are probably going to be able to bring people, students, but also adults to higher levels of global competence. Global competence can be taught. It's not something that is a given. It can be taught. It can be developed in schools through the explicit curriculum, through specific pedagogies, but also through the positive school climate and the cooperative classroom climate that is conducive to the kind of things that we want to achieve with students. You have to practice what you preach. So if we talk about understanding each other, we have to make sure that the school climate and the hidden curriculum and the values embodied in schools and in teachers are very much in the same line. So, dear people, that's what I wanted to tell to you. I'm very happy that you have been interested in this presentation, and I thank you for your attention, and I wish you the very best in our collaborative effort to move global competence forward and to move the world to a better place by 2030 by realizing and achieving the SDGs. Thank you so much.